Have you ever wondered what would happen if one small act of kindness could change your entire life? Emily Zhao was about to discover that returning a lost watch wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about meeting someone who would see her worth when she couldn't see it herself. What she didn't know was that the mysterious owner of that expensive timepiece was Julian Hart, a billionaire CEO who had been hiding from the world, and her simple gesture of honesty would unlock doors she never imagined existed. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The October rain drummed against the windows of paperback paradise, creating a rhythm that matched Emily Zhao's methodical movements as she shelved the last of the day's returns. At 24, she had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through the cramped aisles of the bookstore with the quiet efficiency of someone who preferred the company of fictional characters to real people. Her oversized cardigan hung loosely around her petite frame, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that kept it from falling into her eyes as she worked. The bookstore had been her sanctuary for 3 years now, a place where her shyness felt less like a limitation and more like a natural state of being. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly owner, had long since stopped trying to coax Emily into more social interactions with customers. She had learned to appreciate the young woman's dedication and the way she could recommend the perfect book with just a few whispered questions about preferences. Emily's knowledge of literature was encyclopedic, her memory for plots and characters almost photographic, but ask her to make small talk about the weather and she would flush pink and stammer through awkward pauses. As closing time approached, Emily completed her final tasks with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. She counted the register twice, straightened the already perfect displays, and made sure every book was aligned just so. The familiar routine brought her comfort, a sense of control in a world that often felt overwhelming. She had always been this way, even as a child, preferring the structured predictability of books and quiet spaces to the chaotic energy of playgrounds and parties. The rain had intensified by the time she locked the store's front door, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The streetlights cast wavering reflections on the wet pavement, and most sensible people had already sought shelter indoors. Emily didn't mind the rain, though. There was something peaceful about walking through the city when it was washed clean and quieter than usual, when the usual bustle was muted by the steady patter of droplets on concrete. She took her usual route home, a winding path through the older part of the city where the buildings had character and the streets were lined with trees that had witnessed decades of change. Her small apartment was only 15 minutes away, but Emily always walked slowly, savoring these moments of solitude between work and home. It was during these walks that she did her best thinking, processing the day's interactions and planning for tomorrow's tasks. The watch caught her eye as she turned onto Maple Street, its metal band glinting under the streetlight despite the rain. It lay partially hidden beneath a pile of soggy leaves near the entrance to the Grandview Hotel, one of the city's most prestigious establishments. Emily almost walked past it, her natural inclination to avoid anything that might require her to interact with strangers warring with her deeply ingrained sense of right and wrong. But something about the way the light hit the timepiece made her pause, then crouch down to examine it more closely. Even with her limited knowledge of luxury goods, Emily could tell this was no ordinary watch. The weight of it in her hand spoke of quality craftsmanship, and the intricate face displayed more information than she could immediately decipher. Multiple smaller dials nestled within the main timepiece, and the second hand moved with the smooth precision that suggested expensive engineering. She turned it over carefully, noting the subtle scratches that indicated regular wear, and there, engraved in elegant script, were the initials JH. Emily's first instinct was to leave it at the hotel's front desk, but the thought of walking into such an intimidating establishment made her stomach flutter with anxiety. The Grandview Hotel was the kind of place where celebrities stayed, where business deals worth millions were conducted over dinner, where the staff wore uniforms that probably cost more than Emily's monthly rent. She had walked past it countless times, but never imagined stepping inside. Still, the watch clearly belonged to someone, and someone who could afford to stay at the Grandview was probably missing it desperately. Emily examined the leather strap more closely and found a small tag tucked beneath the buckle. The Grandview Hotel's logo was embossed in gold, along with what appeared to be a room number, though the ink had been partially worn away by the rain. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm her nerves, Emily approached the hotel's main entrance. The doorman, resplendent in his burgundy uniform with gold braiding, stepped forward to open the heavy glass door. His practiced smile faltered slightly when he took in Emily's rain-dampened appearance, her discount store clothing, and her obvious discomfort, but his professionalism remained intact. The lobby was exactly as intimidating as Emily had imagined. Marble floors stretched endlessly under glittering chandeliers, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. Well-dressed guests moved through the space with the confidence of people accustomed to luxury, their conversations a quiet murmur that somehow managed to emphasize the grandeur of their surroundings. Emily felt acutely aware of her wet sneakers squeaking against the polished stone as she made her way to the concierge desk. The woman behind the counter was immaculately groomed, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon and makeup that looked professionally applied. Her name tag read, Patricia, and when she looked up from the computer screen, her expression shifted from polite interest to barely concealed disdain as she took in Emily's appearance. "May I help you?" Patricia asked, her tone suggesting that she doubted there was any way she could be of assistance to someone like Emily. "I found this outside," Emily said quietly, placing the watch on the marble counter. "I think it belongs to one of your guests. The initials are JH, and there's a room number on the strap, but I can't quite make it out." Patricia's demeanor transformed instantly as she recognized the watch. Her eyes widened slightly, and she handled the timepiece with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "Oh my goodness," she breathed. "Mr. Hart has been looking everywhere for this. Where exactly did you find it?" "Just outside, under some leaves by the entrance," Emily replied, surprised by the woman's reaction. Is he a guest here?" "Our most valued guest," Patricia said, her voice taking on a conspiratorial whisper. "He's been staying in the penthouse suite for the past month. Very private, very exclusive. This watch is worth more than most people's cars." She looked at Emily with new interest, as if trying to figure out what kind of person would return something so valuable rather than simply keeping it. Emily shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. "I just wanted to make sure it got back to him," she said. "I should probably go now." "Wait," Patricia said, reaching for the phone. "Let me contact Mr. Hart immediately. I'm sure he'll want to thank you personally." The suggestion sent a spike of panic through Emily's chest. "That's really not necessary," she said quickly. "I'm just glad it found its way back to him." But Patricia was already dialing, her fingers flying over the numbers with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Hart? This is Patricia at the front desk. I have wonderful news about your watch." There was a pause, during which Emily could hear the faint sound of a male voice on the other end of the line. "Yes, sir. A young woman found it outside and brought it in. She's here now if you'd like to speak with her." Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as Patricia held out the phone. She shook her head frantically, but the concierge's expression brooked no argument. With trembling hands, Emily took the receiver. "Hello?" she whispered. The voice that answered was warm and rich, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "I understand you found my watch." "Yes. I'm sorry it took me a while to bring it in. I wasn't sure if I should. I wasn't sure if this was the right place, but the tag had the hotel's name on it, and I thought maybe." Emily trailed off, realizing she was rambling. "You have nothing to apologize for," the man said, and Emily could hear something like amusement in his voice. "I'm incredibly grateful. That watch has tremendous sentimental value. I'm just glad it found its way back to you," Emily said, echoing her earlier words to Patricia. "I'd like to thank you properly," he continued. "Would you be available to meet for coffee tomorrow? There's a cafe called Cornerstone on 5th Street. Very quiet. Very low-key. Would noon work for you?" Emily's immediate instinct was to decline, to insist that no thanks were necessary and escape back to the safety of her routine. But something in the man's voice, a quality she couldn't quite identify, made her pause. I suppose I could meet you there," she heard herself saying. "Excellent," he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I'll be wearing a blue sweater, and I'll be sitting in the back quarter booth. Thank you again, Miss Zhao, Emily supplied. Emily Zhao. Thank you, Emily. I'll see you tomorrow. Emily handed the phone back to Patricia, who was watching the exchange with obvious curiosity. Mr. Hart is a very generous man, she said meaningfully. Very generous. Emily nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and made her way back through the intimidating lobby. The doorman held the door open for her again, and this time his smile seemed more genuine, haute, as if her interaction with one of the hotel's most important guests had elevated her status in his eyes. The walk home passed in a blur of second-guessing and anxiety. What had she been thinking, agreeing to meet a complete stranger? A stranger who was clearly wealthy and important, if Patricia's reaction was any indication. Emily had no experience with situations like this. No framework for understanding what was expected of her. Her social interactions were limited to work colleagues and the occasional conversation with Mrs. Henderson about book recommendations. Her apartment, a studio on the third floor of a converted Victorian house, felt particularly small and shabby when she returned. The furniture was second-hand, but carefully chosen, and she had tried to make the space cozy, with soft lighting and plants on the windowsill. Her books were everywhere, stacked on shelves that covered every available wall space, creating a cocoon of familiar stories and beloved characters. Emily changed into dry clothes and made herself a cup of tea, settling into her reading chair with a novel she had been saving for a special occasion. But the bucker. Words swam before her eyes. Her mind too occupied with the events of the evening to focus on the story. She kept replaying the phone conversation, analyzing every word, every inflection, trying to understand what she had gotten herself into. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful and filled with dreams of marble lobbies and expensive watches. Emily woke feeling unrested, her anxiety having transformed overnight into a kind of low-level dread that colored everything she did. She went through her morning routine mechanically, showering and dressing with the same careful attention she always gave to her appearance. But her mind was elsewhere. The bookstore provided some refuge, its familiar rhythms and quiet atmosphere helping to calm her nerves. She threw herself into work with even more dedication than usual, organizing the new arrivals with meticulous care and helping customers find exactly what they were looking for. Mrs. Henderson noticed her distraction but didn't comment, perhaps recognizing that Emily needed the space to work through whatever was troubling her. As noon approached, Emily's anxiety reached a crescendo. She had considered simply not showing up, pretending that the entire encounter had never happened. But her conscience wouldn't let her be so rude, even to a stranger. She had given her word, and Emily's word meant something to her, even when keeping it made her uncomfortable. Cornerstone Cafe was exactly as Mr. Hart had described, a small, intimate space tucked between a bookshop and a vintage clothing store. The interior was warm and inviting, with exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture that somehow worked together to create an atmosphere of comfortable authenticity. The lunch crowd was sparse, mostly people working on laptops or reading newspapers. And Emily felt some of her tension ease, as she realized this wasn't the intimidating environment she had imagined. She spotted him immediately, sitting in the back quarter booth as promised. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with dark hair that looked like he had been running his fingers through it, and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His blue sweater was expensive, but understated, and there was something about his posture that suggested he was as nervous as she was. Julian Hart had been dreading this meeting almost as much as he had been looking forward to it. In the 3 years since he had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Hart Industries, he had carefully constructed a life of privacy and anonymity. The world believed he was taking a sabbatical, traveling extensively, focusing on personal projects. In reality, he was hiding in plain sight, using his wealth to create a buffer between himself and the demands of being one of the world's youngest billionaires. The pressure had become unbearable somewhere around his 28th birthday, when the success of his technology company had made him a household name and a constant target for media attention. Every decision was scrutinized, every relationship analyzed for ulterior motives. every moment of his life documented by photographers and gossip columnists. He had money, power, and influence, but he had lost something more precious in the process: his sense of self, his ability to form genuine connections with other people. The watch Emily had found was a gift from his grandfather, the man who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. It was the only thing Julian owned that couldn't be replaced with money, the only possession that connected him to a time when his value wasn't measured in stock prices and quarterly earnings. When he realized it was missing, he had felt a panic that had nothing to do with its monetary worth and everything to do with what it represented. He had expected Emily to be like everyone else who had done him favors over the years, calculating and obsequious, angling for some advantage or reward. Instead, her voice on the phone had been soft and uncertain, with no trace of the artificial charm he had learned to recognize and distrust. She had sounded genuinely surprised when he offered to meet her, as if the idea of being thanked for her honesty was foreign to her. Now, watching her navigate the cafe with obvious nervousness, Julian felt something shift inside his chest. She was smaller than he had imagined, with delicate features and dark hair that caught the light streaming through the window. Her clothes were simple but clean, and she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who was accustomed to trying to take up as little space as possible. Emily approached the table with the cautious steps of someone entering unfamiliar territory. "Mr. Hart?" she asked quietly, as if she still wasn't entirely sure she was in the right place. "Julian, please," he said, standing to shake her hand. Her grip was firm but brief, and he noticed the way she tucked her hands into her sleeves afterward, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Emily admitted, sliding into the booth across from him. "I'm not very good at this kind of thing." "What kind of thing?" Julian asked, genuinely curious. "Meeting people. Talking to strangers. Being social." She looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "I work in a bookstore." "Books are easier than people." Julian smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt in weeks. "I understand completely. People are complicated. Books have beginnings, middles, and ends. They make sense." Emily looked up at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to understand. "Exactly. And if you don't like how a book ends, you can just read a different one." "Unfortunately, real life doesn't work that way," Julian said, "though I've spent the last few years trying to pretend it does." They ordered coffee and pastries, and Julian found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Emily was nothing like the people he usually met, those who calculated every word and gesture for maximum impact. She was honest, to the point of being disarming, answering his questions about her work and her life with a straightforwardness that was both refreshing and slightly heartbreaking. She told him about her love of literature, her dream of perhaps writing someday, her contentment with her quiet life, despite the financial struggles that came with working retail. She spoke about her books the way other people talked about their children, with a warmth and enthusiasm that transformed her entire demeanor. Julian found himself genuinely interested in her opinions, her insights into character development and narrative structure revealing an intelligence that had probably been overlooked by most people who met her. "I have a confession to make," Julian said after they had been talking for nearly an hour. "I didn't just ask you here to thank you for the watch." Emily's expression immediately became guarded, and Julian could see her retreating into herself. "Oh," she said quietly. "I spend most of my time alone these days," Julian continued, choosing his words carefully. "I don't meet many people who do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. You could have kept that watch, sold it, and no one would have been the wiser. But you didn't." "I couldn't," Emily said simply. "It wasn't mine. Most people would have at least considered it," Julian said. "The watch is worth about $50,000. Emily's eyes widened, and she looked genuinely shocked. $50,000? For a watch? "It's a Philippe Dufour simplicity," Julian said, amused by her reaction. "There are only about 200 of them in existence." "I had no idea," Emily said, shaking her head. "I mean, I could tell it was expensive, but I never imagined." She trailed off, looking slightly overwhelmed. "Which makes what you did even more remarkable." Julian said. You returned something incredibly valuable without even knowing its worth. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Anyone would have done the same thing. I don't think that's true, Julian said gently. And that's what makes you special. The word special seemed to hang in the air between them, and Emily looked like she wanted to disappear into the booth. Julian realized he was making her uncomfortable and changed the subject, asking about her favorite books, her thoughts on different authors, anything to bring back the ease they had shared earlier. As they talked, Julian found himself watching Emily's face, noticing the way her eyes lit up when she discussed a particularly beloved novel, the way her hands moved expressively when she was explaining a complex plot point. There was something captivating about her passion, her complete lack of pretense or artifice. She was the most genuine person he had met in years, perhaps ever. I have a proposition for you, Julian said finally, when their coffee cups were empty and the afternoon sun was slanting through the cafe windows. Emily's expression immediately became wary again. What kind of proposition? I'm working on a project, Julian said, which was true, though he had no intention of explaining that the project was essentially learning how to be human again. I need someone to help me research historical contexts for various topics. Someone with extensive knowledge of literature and history. Someone who can find obscure references and make connections between different works. You want to hire me as a researcher? Emily asked, clearly confused. I want to offer you a position that would allow you to work with books and ideas all day, to dive deep into subjects that interest you, and to be paid very well for it, Julian said. You'd have access to private libraries, rare manuscripts, first editions. You'd be working on projects that could make a real difference in the world. Emily stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. I don't understand, she said finally. You don't know anything about me. You don't know if I'm qualified, if I'm reliable, if I can do the work you're describing. I know you're honest, Julian said. I know you're intelligent and passionate about literature. I know you care about doing the right thing even when it's difficult or inconvenient. Those are the qualities I need. What's the catch? Emily asked, and Julian could see the walls going up around her again. No catch, Julian said. Just an opportunity. Emily was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands. Julian could practically see the internal debate playing out across her features, hope warring with fear, excitement battling with doubt. Finally, she looked up at him. Why me? She asked. Really? Why me? Julian considered his answer carefully. He could tell her about his isolation, his struggle to find people he could trust, his desperate need for genuine human connection. He could explain about the years of dealing with people who saw him only as a means to an end, who calculated every interaction for maximum benefit. But he sensed that Emily would be overwhelmed by that level of honesty, that she would retreat even further into herself if she understood the full weight of what he was offering. Because, he said finally, you returned a stranger's watch in the rain without expecting anything in return. Because you see books as friends rather than objects. Because when you talk about something you love, your whole face changes. Because I think you understand what it means to be lonely, and I think you might understand what it means to want something more. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Julian thought he had said too much, pushed too hard. But then she smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made him understand why he had been so drawn to her. When would I start? She asked. Julian felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. Tomorrow, if you want. I'll have Patricia at the hotel arrange temporary accommodations while we find you a proper place. The pay is $200,000 a year, plus benefits, plus research expenses. Emily's face went pale. $200,000? That's more than I make in 5 years. It's what the position is worth, Julian said simply. And it's what you're worth. The word worth seemed to hit Emily like a physical blow. She looked down at her hands again, and Julian could see her struggling with something. Some internal voice that was telling her she didn't deserve this, that it was too good to be true. But she was fooling herself if she thought she could succeed in such a role. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered. I don't know if I can either, Julian said, But I'd like to try, if you're willing. Emily looked up at him, and Julian saw something in her eyes that made his heart skip a beat. It was trust. Fragile and uncertain, but real nonetheless. "Okay," she said. "I'll try." Julian felt a smile spread across his face, the first genuine happiness he had experienced in months. "Then let's get started." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity that left Emily feeling like she was living someone else's life. Julian had been true to his word about everything, arranging for her to stay in a beautiful suite at the Grandview Hotel while they looked for a permanent apartment, providing her with a research budget that seemed impossibly generous, and giving her access to resources she had only dreamed of. Her first project was to research the historical context of various philosophical movements and their influence on modern literature. It was exactly the kind of work Emily had always imagined herself doing if she had been brave enough to pursue graduate school, if she had believed she was smart enough to succeed in academia. Julian provided her with a list of topics and questions, but he gave her complete freedom in how she approached the research, trusting her instincts and following her curiosity wherever it led. Emily threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. She spent her days in the hotel's business center, surrounded by books and papers, following intellectual threads that seemed to connect everything from ancient Greek philosophy to contemporary fiction. She discovered connections she had never noticed before, patterns that spanned centuries and cultures, ideas that seemed to speak directly to questions she had been carrying around for years without fully understanding them. Julian checked in with her regularly, but he was careful not to hover or micromanage. Their meetings were more like conversations between colleagues than formal work sessions, and Emily found herself looking forward to them with an anticipation that had nothing to do with professional obligation. He listened to her ideas with genuine interest, asking questions that pushed her thinking in new directions, offering insights that revealed the depth of his own education and intelligence. Slowly, Emily began to understand that Julian was not quite who he appeared to be. There were hints in their conversations, references to experiences that suggested a level of wealth and influence that went far beyond what she had initially imagined. He spoke casually about traveling to libraries in different countries, about having access to private collections, about resources that were available to very few people. But he never explained exactly who he was or how he had acquired such connections, and Emily was too polite to ask directly. It was during their third week of working together that Emily finally discovered the truth about Julian's identity. She had been researching the influence of Renaissance humanism on modern business ethics, following a thread that had started with a casual comment Julian had made about the responsibility of power. Her research had led her to examine the corporate philosophies of various contemporary companies, and she had stumbled across an article about Hart Industries and its reclusive founder. The photograph accompanying the article showed a man in an expensive suit, standing before a wall of corporate logos, but Emily recognized the eyes immediately. They were the same intelligent, slightly melancholy eyes that had been watching her across cafe tables and hotel meeting rooms for the past 3 weeks. The same eyes that had looked at her with such genuine interest when she talked about her favorite books, that had lit up with amusement when she made a particularly insightful observation about character development in Victorian novels. Julian Hart wasn't just wealthy. He was one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation. Hart Industries had revolutionized 3 different sectors of technology, and Julian's personal net worth was estimated in the billions. He had been featured on magazine covers, profiled in documentaries, and courted by governments and corporations around the world. He was exactly the kind of person Emily had always imagined existed in a completely different universe from her own. The revelation left Emily feeling disoriented and slightly betrayed. She understood why Julian had been vague about his background, but she couldn't help wondering if their entire relationship had been built on a lie. Was she just a charity case to him, a way to feel better about his wealth and privilege? Had their conversations been genuine, or was he simply amusing himself with her naivety? She was still processing these questions when Julian arrived for their scheduled meeting that afternoon. He took one look at her face and seemed to understand immediately what had happened. "You know," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from her. "I was researching corporate responsibility, and I came across an article about Hart Industries," Emily said, her voice carefully neutral. Imagine my surprise when I saw your photograph." Julian was quiet for a long moment, and Emily could see him weighing his words carefully. "I should have told you," he said finally. "I wanted to, but I wasn't sure how to explain without it changing everything between us." "Changing everything how?" Emily asked. "The way people treat me when they know who I am," Julian said. "The way they calculate every interaction, every word, every gesture. The way they stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as an opportunity." Emily considered this, understanding for the first time the weight of what Julian had been carrying. "Is that why you've been hiding? Living under an assumed name?" "I haven't been living under an assumed name," Julian said. "I've just been living quietly. Hart Industries runs itself these days. I have excellent people in charge of operations, and I needed time to figure out who I am when I'm not being Julian Hart, billionaire, CEO. And who are you?" "Oh," Emily asked. Julian looked at her with an expression that was vulnerable and uncertain. "I'm still trying to figure that out. But I know I'm someone who feels more like himself when he's talking to you about books than when he's sitting in boardrooms making decisions that affect thousands of people." Emily felt something shift inside her chest, a wall crumbling that she hadn't even realized she had built. "You could have told me," she said softly. "I wouldn't have treated you differently." "Wouldn't you have?" Julian asked. "If I had introduced myself as Julian Hart, CEO of Hart Industries, worth approximately $4 billion, would you have agreed to meet me for coffee? Would you have taken the job? Would you have talked to me the way you do now?" Emily opened her mouth to say yes, then closed it again as she realized he was probably right. She would have been intimidated, overwhelmed, convinced that someone like him could never be interested in someone like her. She would have retreated into herself and never given him the chance to know the real her. "The work you've been doing," Julian continued, "it's not busy work or charity. It's research for a foundation I'm starting, focused on education and literacy programs. The connections you've been making between philosophical movements and contemporary issues, the way you've been tracing the influence of literature on social change, it's exactly what I need to understand how to use resources effectively to make a real difference." End quote. Emily looked down at the papers scattered across the table, her weeks of research suddenly taking on new meaning. "A foundation? I've been thinking about it for years," Julian said. "But I needed to understand the theoretical framework first, the historical precedents, the philosophical foundations that would make it more than just another rich person's tax write-off. I needed someone who could see the big picture, who could understand how ideas and literature and social movements connect to create real change." End quote. "And you think I can do that?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know you can," Julian said. "I've seen you do it. The report you wrote about the influence of African American literature on civil rights legislation, the way you connected the dots between Enlightenment philosophy and modern concepts of corporate responsibility, the analysis of how storytelling traditions have shaped contemporary approaches to conflict resolution. That's the kind of thinking that can change the world." End quote. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. For the first time in her life, someone was seeing her not as a shy bookstore clerk who was afraid of her own shadow, but as an intellectual capable of making meaningful contributions to important work. Someone was looking at her and seeing potential instead of limitations. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Julian said. "But I think we can be scared together and still do something important." Over the following weeks, Emily threw herself into the foundation work with a passion that surprised even her. She was no longer just researching abstract philosophical concepts. She was helping to design programs that would provide books and educational resources to underserved communities, developing literacy initiatives that would reach children who had never had access to quality education, creating frameworks for evaluating the effectiveness of different approaches to social change. Julian was a constant presence throughout the process, but not in the way Emily had expected. He didn't micromanage or override her decisions. Instead, he listened to her ideas and helped her think through the implications of different approaches. He challenged her assumptions and pushed her to consider perspectives she might have missed, but he never made her feel stupid or inadequate. He treated her as an equal partner in the work, someone whose insights were valuable and whose contributions mattered. As they worked together, Emily began to see beyond Julian's wealth and status to the person underneath. She saw his genuine desire to make a difference, his frustration with the superficiality of his previous life, his loneliness, and his struggle to form authentic connections with people. She saw his intelligence and his humor, his kindness and his vulnerability. She saw, in other words, someone who was as scared and uncertain as she was, someone who was also trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted from life. Their relationship began to shift from professional to personal, almost without Emily realizing it. Their work meetings turned into long conversations about books and ideas and dreams. They started meeting for dinner instead of just coffee, talking late into the evening about everything from childhood memories to philosophical questions to silly observations about the people around them. Julian made Emily laugh in a way that surprised her, and she began to see glimpses of the person he might have been if he hadn't been burdened with so much responsibility and scrutiny from such a young age. Emily also began to see herself differently. Under Julian's encouragement, she started to speak up more in meetings, to share her ideas with confidence instead of hiding behind apologies and self-deprecation. She began to dress differently, not to impress anyone, but because she was starting to feel like someone who deserved to take up space in the world. She moved out of the hotel and into a beautiful apartment that Julian helped her find, a space that was entirely her own, but which felt like a home in a way her old studio never had. The foundation officially launched 6 months after Emily had found Julian's watch in the rain. The press conference was held at the Grandview Hotel, and Emily watched from the back of the room as Julian announced the Hart Foundation's mission and goals. He spoke with passion and conviction about the power of education and literacy to transform lives, about the importance of giving everyone access to the tools they need to succeed. He talked about the research that had informed their approach, the philosophical foundations that guided their work, the evidence-based strategies they would use to measure success. Emily felt a pride she had never experienced before as she listened to Julian describe work that she had helped create, ideas that had emerged from their conversations and collaboration. For the first time in her life, she was part of something bigger than herself, something that might actually make a difference in the world. After the press conference, Julian found her in the crowd of journalists and foundation board members and donors. "There's someone I want you to meet," he said, leading her toward a distinguished-looking woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "Emily, this is Margaret Chen, the director of the Children's Literacy Initiative," Julian said. "Margaret, this is Emily Zhao, the person I was telling you about." Margaret smiled warmly and shook Emily's hand. "Julian has told me so much about your work on the theoretical framework for the foundation. I'm incredibly impressed by your analysis of how storytelling traditions can be leveraged to improve educational outcomes. I was wondering if you might be interested in presenting your findings at our national conference next month." Emily felt a familiar flutter of panic at the thought of speaking in front of a large audience, but she also felt something new, excitement. "I'd love to," she heard herself saying. Julian smiled at her, and Emily saw something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had left and the hotel staff had begun cleaning up the remnants of the reception, Emily and Julian found themselves alone in the hotel's rooftop garden. The city spread out below them like a constellation of lights, and the cool night air carried the scent of jasmine from the carefully tended flower beds. "I can't believe this is real," Emily said softly, looking out over the skyline. 6 months ago, I was shelving books and worrying about making rent. Now, I'm co-founding a foundation that could help thousands of children. It's real because you made it real," Julian said, moving to stand beside her at the railing. "The foundation exists because of your vision, your research, your insights. I just provided the funding." Emily turned to look at him, noting the way the moonlight caught the angles of his face, the way his expression had softened in the months they had been working together. "You did more than provide funding," she said. "You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." Julian was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I've been thinking about that night you called me at the hotel," he said finally. "You? apologized for bothering me, for taking up my time, for existing in my world even for a few minutes. You couldn't understand why anyone would want to thank you for doing the right thing." Emily felt a familiar flush of embarrassment. "I'm not very good at accepting praise." "You're not very good at accepting that you matter," Julian corrected gently. "But you do matter, Emily. You matter more than you know." There was something in his voice that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. She had learned to read Julian's moods over the months they had worked together, had come to recognize the subtle shifts in his expression that indicated when he was troubled, or excited, or deep in thought. But this was different. This was something she had never heard before. "Julian," she said quietly, not sure what she was asking. He turned to face her fully, and Emily could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the vulnerability that he usually kept hidden behind his careful composure. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I should have said weeks ago, but I was afraid it would ruin everything we've built." Emily's heart began to race, but she forced herself to remain still, to give him the space to say whatever he needed to say. "I'm falling in love with you," Julian said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back for so long that they could no longer be contained. "I know it's complicated. I know it changes everything. I know it might make you uncomfortable. But I can't pretend anymore that this is just about work, that you're just a colleague or a friend." Emily stared at him, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. Julian Hart, billionaire CEO, was in love with her. It seemed impossible, like something that happened in the romance novels she secretly read but never admitted to enjoying. "I don't understand," she said finally. "You could have anyone. Any woman in the world would be thrilled to be with you." Julian's smile was sad and knowing. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "Any woman in the world would be thrilled to be with Julian Hart, billionaire CEO. They'd be thrilled to be with my money, my status, my influence. But you fell asleep during our third meeting because you'd been up all night reading about medieval scholasticism for a research project that excited you more than anything else in your life." Emily felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm sorry about that. I was just so tired, and the information was so fascinating, I lost track of time." "Don't apologize," Julian said, stepping closer to her. "That was the moment I knew I was in trouble. You were more interested in Thomas Aquinas than in impressing me, and I found that more attractive than any amount of designer clothes or practiced charm." Emily looked down at her hands, trying to process the emotions swirling through her chest. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to be with someone like you." "Someone like me?" Julian asked. "Someone important, someone who matters, someone who belongs in a world I don't understand." Julian reached out and gently tilted her chin up so she was looking at him. "You belong in any world you choose to be in," he said. "You're brilliant, you're kind, you're passionate about things that matter. You've already changed my world more than you know." Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "What if I'm not enough? What if I can't be what you need?" "You're already everything I need," Julian said softly. "You're real, Emily. You're genuine and honest and unafraid to be yourself. Do you know how rare that is? Do you know how long I've been searching for someone who sees me as a person instead of a portfolio?" Emily thought about the past 6 months, about the way their relationship had evolved from professional to personal, about the conversations that had stretched late into the night, about the way Julian looked at her when she was explaining a particularly complex theoretical concept. She thought about the way he listened to her ideas, the way he challenged her thinking, the way he made her feel like her thoughts and opinions mattered. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Julian said. "But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." Emily looked into his eyes and saw the same vulnerability she felt reflected back at her. She saw the loneliness that had driven him to hide from the world, the same loneliness that had made her retreat into books and solitude. She saw someone who was as uncertain about love as she was, someone who was taking just as big a risk by opening his heart. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said quietly, the words feeling strange and wonderful on her tongue. Julian's smile was like sunrise, bright and warm and full of promise. "Really? Really?" Emily said, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely certain about something important. Julian reached for her hands, and Emily didn't pull away. His palms were warm and slightly calloused, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to hold hands with him while walking through the city. To have someone to share her thoughts and dreams with. To belong to someone who understood her in a way no one ever had. "Where do we go from here?" she asked. "Wherever you want," Julian said. "We can take this as slowly as you need. We can keep working together, building the foundation, making a difference. We can figure out the rest as we go." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of possibility she had never experienced before. For the first time in her life, the future felt bright and full of potential instead of scary and uncertain. "I have another confession," Julian said, his voice taking on a lighter tone. "What now?" Emily asked, laughing despite her nervousness. "I've been carrying that watch in my pocket for the past month," Julian said. "I keep meaning to put it back on, but every time I look at it, I think about that night you called me at the hotel, about how your voice sounded so surprised when I wanted to thank you. I think about how you could have just left it where you found it, or kept it, or sold it. But instead, you walked into the most intimidating building in the city because you knew I was missing something important." Emily felt her heart skip a beat. "You've been carrying it around?" Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the watch, its metal surface gleaming in the moonlight. "I've been carrying it around because it reminds me of the night my life changed," he said. "The night I met someone who saw a lost watch and thought about the person who was missing it, instead of thinking about what she could gain from finding it." Emily stared at the watch, remembering the way it had felt in her hands that rainy evening, remembering her nervousness about returning it, remembering the phone call that had started everything. "It's beautiful," she said. "It was my grandfather's," Julian said. "He gave it to me when I graduated from college. He told me that time was the only thing that couldn't be bought or sold, only given freely to the people who mattered." Emily looked up at him. "And you're getting your time to me?" "I'm giving you everything," Julian said simply, "if you want it." Emily felt something settle into place inside her chest, a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. She thought about the shy bookstore clerk she had been 6 months ago, afraid of her own shadow, content to live in the margins of life. She thought about the woman she was becoming, someone who spoke up in meetings, who presented research to distinguished academics, who was helping to build something that could change the world. "I want it," she said. "I want everything." Julian's kiss was gentle and tentative at first, as if he was afraid she might change her mind. But Emily kissed him back with a certainty that surprised them both, her hands tangling in his hair, her heart hammering against her ribs with excitement instead of fear. When they finally broke apart, Emily felt dizzy with happiness and possibility. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go back to work," Julian said, his arms sliding around her waist. "We launch the Foundation's first programs, we hire staff, we change the world, one literacy initiative at a time. And we do it together." Emily smiled, thinking about the presentation she would give at the national conference, about the programs they would implement, about the children whose lives might be different because of the work they were doing. She thought about the books she would read, and the research she would conduct, and the conversations she would have with Julian about ideas that mattered. "Together," she repeated, and the word felt like a promise. 6 months later, Emily stood before an audience of 300 educators, administrators, and literacy advocates at the National Children's Literacy Conference. She wore a navy blue dress that Julian had helped her pick out, and her hair was pulled back in a sophisticated twist that made her look older and more confident than she felt. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice was clear and steady as she began to speak. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Emily Zhao, and I'm here to talk to you about the power of storytelling to transform not just individual lives, but entire communities." She looked out at the sea of faces, all turned toward her with expressions of interest and attention, and felt a familiar flutter of nervousness. But then she caught sight of Julian in the third row, wearing the blue sweater he had worn to their first coffee meeting, and she felt her confidence return. 18 months ago, I was a bookstore clerk who was afraid to speak up in staff meetings, Emily continued. I thought my love of literature was just a personal quirk, something that made me different in a way that didn't matter to anyone else. I was wrong. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a photograph of children in a rural school district reading books from the Hart Foundation's mobile library program. These children are proof that stories matter, that access to books and literacy programs can change the trajectory of entire communities. But they're also proof that sometimes the most important thing we can do is believe in people's potential, even when they don't believe in it themselves. Emily talked about the research she had conducted, the programs they had implemented, the measurable outcomes they had achieved in their first year of operation. She talked about the theoretical frameworks that guided their work, the evidence-based strategies they used to evaluate success, the partnerships they had formed with schools and community organizations. But mostly, she talked about the children. She talked about Maria, a 7-year-old who had been labeled as learning disabled until she discovered graphic novels and realized that stories could be told in pictures as well as words. She talked about James, a teenager who had been heading toward dropping out of school until he found poetry and discovered that his experiences had value and meaning. She talked about entire communities where literacy rates had improved dramatically after the introduction of culturally relevant reading materials and family literacy programs. The Hart Foundation's work is based on a simple premise, Emily said as she approached the end of her presentation. Everyone deserves access to the transformative power of literacy. Everyone deserves to see themselves reflected in the stories they read. Everyone deserves to believe that their voice matters, that their experiences have value, that they have something important to contribute to the world. She paused, looking out at the audience, and felt a surge of pride and purpose that still surprised her sometimes. But perhaps most importantly, everyone deserves to have someone believe in their potential, even when they can't see it themselves. Sometimes all it takes is one person who sees your worth, who gives you the tools you need to succeed, who refuses to let you hide in the shadows because they know you have light to share with the world. The applause was thunderous, and Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she gathered her materials and stepped away from the podium. She had done it. She had stood in front of hundreds of people and shared her work, her passion, her vision for changing the world through literacy and education. Julian was waiting for her as she came down from the stage, his smile brighter than any spotlight. "I'm so proud of you," he said, pulling her into a hug that felt like coming home. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Emily said into his shoulder. "Yes, you could have," Julian said, pulling back to look at her. "You just needed someone to remind you that you were capable of it." Later that evening, they walked through the city where they had first met, past the bookstore where Emily had worked, past the hotel where Julian had been hiding from the world, past the cafe where they had shared their first coffee and discovered that they understood each other in ways that neither had expected. "Do you ever miss it?" Emily asked as they paused outside Paperback Paradise. "Your old life, I mean. The privacy, the anonymity." Julian considered the question seriously. "I miss the simplicity sometimes," he said. "But I don't miss the loneliness. I don't miss feeling like I didn't matter to anyone as a person, rather than as a source of wealth or influence." Emily nodded, understanding. Her own life had become more complicated as the foundation grew and her reputation as an education researcher developed. There were speaking engagements now, interviews with journalists, meetings with government officials and philanthropists. But she had never felt more like herself, never felt more certain that she was doing work that mattered. "I have something for you," Julian said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the familiar shape of the watchbox. "Julian, you don't need to give me presents." "It's not a present exactly," Julian said, opening the box to reveal not his grandfather's watch, but a different one, smaller and more delicate, with a face that showed phases of the moon and constellations. "It's a reminder." Emily stared at the watch, noting the careful craftsmanship, the way the starlight seemed to dance across the intricate face. "It's beautiful," she whispered. It's made by the same company that made my grandfather's watch, Julian said. But this one is yours. I had it engraved. Emily turned the watch over and read the inscription on the back. To Emily, who shows me the stars. Time given freely to those who matter. All my love, J. Julian. She breathed, her voice thick with emotion. I know we haven't talked about the future yet, Julian said, his voice uncertain. I know we're still figuring things out. But I want you to know that whatever happens, however this story ends, you've already given me more than I ever thought possible. Emily looked up at him, this man who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself, who had given her the courage to step out of the shadows and into a life she had never imagined. How do you think this story ends? She asked. Julian smiled, the expression that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. I think it ends with us changing the world, he said. Together. Emily fastened the watch around her wrist, feeling the weight of it against her skin, the steady tick of seconds that reminded her that time was precious and finite, and meant to be shared with people who mattered. She thought about the shy bookstore clerk she had been, the confident woman she was becoming, the future that stretched ahead of them full of possibility and purpose. I love you, she said, the words coming easily now, naturally, without the fear and uncertainty that had once characterized every aspect of her life. I love you too, Julian replied, and Emily could hear the smile in his voice, could feel the warmth of his hand as he took hers. They walked home together through the city streets, past the places where their story had begun, toward the future they would build together. Emily's watch caught the light from the street lamps, its face reflecting the stars above them, keeping time for two people who had found in each other something more valuable than money or status or fame. They had found love and purpose and the courage to believe that they deserved both. The Hart Foundation would go on to serve over 50,000 children in its first 5 years, with Emily as its Director of Research and Program Development. Her work would be featured in academic journals and education policy papers, and she would be invited to speak at conferences around the world. But she would always remember that it all started with a watch found in the rain, returned not because she expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. And Julian would always carry his grandfather's watch in his pocket, not because he had lost it, but because it reminded him of the night his real life began. The night he met someone who saw a stranger's lost possession and thought not about what she could gain, but about what someone else had lost. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and sometimes the most profound changes come from the simple decision to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Even when there's no reward except the knowledge that you've made someone else's day a little bit better. Emily Zhao had learned that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined, but more importantly, she had learned that she was worthy of love, of success, of a life that mattered. And in learning to see her own worth, she had found the courage to help others see theirs as well. The watch on her wrist ticked steadily onward, marking the passage of time that she was no longer afraid to claim as her own. Time that she was learning to spend on things and people that mattered. Time that she was finally ready to live instead of simply endure. In the end, that may be the most valuable gift of all, the knowledge that we are worthy of the time we've been given, and the courage to use it well.